Welcome back, boys. Today we're checking out Explaining Jewish Civilization by Whatifalthist. So I guess he's gonna explain it. It's I don't know much about it. It's a very like difficult subject. I don't know much about it, so I'm very interested in.
Boy, we've got to the video you folks have been waiting a while for. I did something like over 3,000 pages of research for these 2 videos on Jewish civilization, so please have some gratitude. I've been trying to
3,000.
make a list of the most accomplished ethnicities in history. I don't really want to rank them, since I don't think that's how reality really works. You can't really enumerate reality, and once you try, you lose touch with the living, beautiful spirit that is human life and existence.
Yeah, enjoy what you have.
However, on my list, I have the Anglo-Saxons, Chinese, Italians, Greeks, Germans, and the Jews, just to name a handful of obvious choices, as well as a few other ethnicities I didn't name there. Once you combine them with their ethnic diasporas, the Anglo-Saxons, Germans, and Italians each have over 100 million people around the world today. The Greeks used to rule the known world, and hell, there's over 1 billion Chinese today. That being said, when you're looking at the Jews, you're seeing a population that's only a little bit more than 15 million people today combined around the world.
Yeah, there weren't many. 50 million. I thought it was 13. But yeah, there aren't actually that many Jewish people around the world.
For a frame of reference, my home state of Pennsylvania has 13 million people. There's a joke that Finland could hypothetically not exist, since the standard deviation for population numbers the UN uses, due to places like Africa or Asia, is large enough that statistically, as a sort of joke, the entire population of Finland is beneath that number. It's the same thing with the Jews. If an alien were to look at this, they'd be in complete shock. How could this tiny group of people spread around the world and break the world over multiple times again and again? However, for the inhabitants of this earth, the effect of the Jews on world history is so obvious that only a fool or an Oriental who's never heard of the God of Abraham could say they never knew about it. What happened here? The history of the Jews, once you get into the details, is even more absurd. This tiny population in the Middle East 4,000 years ago, an era in which almost no one is still alive today, is still important and powerful, dominating many of the major industries of the greatest superpower. This small people indirectly made the 3 largest religions in the world, or Marxism, Christianity, and Islam. In many fields, Jews are 1/3 of Nobel Prize winners, while comprising vastly less than even 1% of the world's population. The Jews have been batted around the world to nearly every continent. What happened here? Historians today like to see the world as operating under reason and probability, in which, almost like statistical models, changes occur gradually over time for incentive structures. The fact that this 4,000-year-old desert tribe still exists and is thriving is a middle finger to the idea that the world is reasonable or practical. As I like to say, it just happens, and then we have to rationalize later why it makes sense. By the way, before I get
I hear what they say.
started, I know this is a controversial topic in both directions. The Jews are steeped in controversy on both the part of their lovers and haters. In researching this, I read books from both pro-Semites and anti-Semites to get every perspective in the search of truth. I continue to stand by the law of chill vibes, that I refuse to care about anything unless I'm forced to. I think the mob is innately
The law of chill vibes. Maybe I should adopt that too, huh?
stupid, envious, and predatory. Thus, I refuse to give an inch and just say what I believe to be factually true. Psych! Let's get started.
Yeah. I care too. Like I want to learn more and help people out if I can.
Part 1, Abraham's People. I mentioned this in the other video, but one of the coolest facts we've discovered recently is that from analyzing the Y chromosomes of people who claim his descent, we have effectively proven the existence of Abraham, the biblical father of both the Jews and Arabs, given they share an ancestor in that place and time. This leads to an acronym
Cool.
I've developed, or
I don't think I'm a descendant.
TAWI, which means the ancients weren't idiots. When I say this, it speaks to the trend we keep on finding that ancient myths that we used to not take seriously, as we gather more evidence, are consistently more accurate than we originally thought. Easy examples of this are Troy and the biblical flood, and I talk about this more in the text wall in front of you. According to the Jewish tradition, they started out in the area around modern Iraq, where Abraham was fleeing the moral corruption of the Mesopotamian city-state of Uruk around 2000 BC. This shows an opening for two different important points of Jewish history. The first being that the Jews were a sort of scavenger people along the edges of the older Fertile Crescent civilizations. The second being that the Jews were a reaction to the collapsing sociological institutions to the end of civilizational cycle 1. There had already been pre-established civilization.
Man, I just have to say, there's probably gonna be so much info that I'm not gonna remember. So if you guys can comment like important stuff or like things I should remember, I would appreciate that.
For thousands of years in a territory stretching in an arc from Egypt to the bottom.
It has to be like reality, no political anything, just reality, just the truth. That's what I only care about, the truth.
Of Iraq called the Fertile Crescent. According to the biblical myth, the Jews started in Iraq, following the edge of the desert to reach modern Israel and the frontiers of Egypt, where we have the first records of a people who could be the Jews, or the Hapiru from Egyptian records. The Jews existed in this weird place between barbarism, civilization, being a social class, an ethnicity, or a religious group. There are two groups in America which I think are useful proxies for the Jews, the first being the Mormons and the latter being the desert trash. Oftentimes, you'll find that areas with similar climates will develop comparable cultural traits, even if they don't have much else in common. So it's not super strange to draw parallels between the desert climate of the American West and the Middle East. The Mormons are an American religious group originally seeded from the Yankee diaspora in places like Vermont or upstate New York and Ohio. They were founded during the Second Great Awakening in the early 19th century and migrated west, populating the area around Utah and the neighboring states where they formed a sort of distinct ethnic identity. The Mormon Church acted as a centrally planned theocracy which strategically populated the American West on purpose. The similarities between the Jews and Mormons are that they both unified into very strong degrees of in-group cooperation by holding strange religious beliefs. The Mormons were known for a very distinct theology, practicing polygamy at the start, being ruled by a central church theocratic hierarchy, banning alcohol and ritual prescriptions. The Mormons are known for being simultaneously very strange, being seen as a cult by many Americans, but also admired by other Americans for their moral character between having very high social trust, birth rates, social cooperation, and good values. The Jews were seen in a very similar light by the neighboring Middle Eastern peoples. A funny element to this is that because the Bible has colored so much of our understanding of the ancient Middle East's history in total, it would be as if 3,000 to 4,000 years in the future, the only main narrative that people would study modern American history through would be through the history of the Mormons. And that's just one of the ironic things that you'll see over history, a few different places and times. And it's hard to see this now, given we live in a world where Jewish religion won on such a global scale, but in the ancient world of kings and gods, the Jews were seen as strange, as we would see the Mormons today. The Jews were the most religious people of the ancient world, even in time periods like Greco-Roman classical dominance, in which secularism was very powerful.
So they were the most like, uh, how do you say it? Like devote. They had the most conviction for their uh, beliefs.
And the Jews even had one of the highest birth rates. In some ways, the religiosity combined with militarism during that Hellenistic time period is reminiscent of Islamic radicals like the Taliban today. On top of this, the Jews had lots of ritual prescriptions, which over the course of Jewish history became completely encumbering in every single aspect of life. For its entire history, the Jews were a theocracy where the religious ruling class constantly made the religion more complex and autistic. There was a very long time when the Jewish practice of monotheism was seen as insane in a world dominated by polytheism. On top of this, the dietary restrictions like no pork
I don't know what theism. What he say?
consumption, denial of other gods, circumcision, never taking the Lord's name in vain, sexual prudery, among others, were seen as very strange. This was seen as trying too hard by every other ancient people, in the same way the moderns look at the Mormons or Islamic religious fundamentalists, thinking, why did they have to do all of those
It's a belief in more than one god.
weird things? However, this was partly by design, in the same way the Mormons were purposely trying to isolate from the broader American society by moving across the great American desert to Utah. The Jews were using all of these ritual prescriptions as a sort of shit test, or a term from dating discourse, in which a girl will purposely insult you as a way to test your confidence in
I can teach you guys about shit test too.
order to establish insanely high in-group cooperation.
All women shit test you. It doesn't matter your height, your looks, your money. It does not matter. And if you fail the shit test, you can be like the most high status quality man in the fucking world. But if you fail the shit test, the woman will look more down on you. There is like, there's nuance there. There isn't like you fail one and then you boom, you're gone. The woman is gonna cheat on you. No, but if you fail them continuously, the woman will not respect you.
And sense of community. If you were willing to sacrifice this much for the religion, it meant you really cared and could be trusted. Part of the reason for this is that Israel was stuck in the middle of the map. I literally calculated it, and the Levant is the region that has faced the most invasions over world history. The Jews were a tiny group surrounded by greater powers on all sides, whether the Egyptians, Persians, Babylonians, Assyrians, Greeks, or Romans. Thus, the Jews started to look at different strategies for survival, which were more subtle. In other terms, under the constant pressure of constant external threats, the Jews turned to religion partly to hold their community together under the threat of constant foreign conquest. At the very same time, religion was a way of sort of hacking the game that was placed on extra hard mode against their consent. One of the Jews' most admirable traits is an insane level of introspection on the part of an ancient society. When you look at the ancient world, you see an era in which the Assyrians bragging about publicly torturing their enemies for state propaganda being relatively normal, or where every great power tried to glorify their own power as much as possible, normally to ridiculous, improbable degrees. The Jews have an incredibly strong educational tradition, which stems from this priest class's emphasis on introspection and wisdom. As I said before, the Jews were a theocracy for almost all of their history, and for much of it a hereditary rabbi ruling class which practiced polygamy. What this did was create a cultural and genetic selection pressure for high verbal intelligence and analysis abilities, which is why the Jews are per capita the highest achieving demographic in the world intellectually. It's part of the reason why Jews can make up 40% of Nobel Prize winners in physics or economics, while being 0.1% of the total population.
Was Albert Einstein a Jew? I didn't know that.
The Jews are literally the only group, besides Northwest Europeans, which have generated innovation in the modern world. Meanwhile, with the Jews, they used religion as a sort of playthrough system in which they could corroborate millennia of evidence to see what would and would not work. The Old Testament is a historic record of the Jewish nation from roughly 2000 BC to 400 BC, in which the Jews wrote about what did and did not work for them as a nation. Part of the reason the Bible has become the most important book in history is that the Jews faced nearly every single thing a nation can face, since it was written over such a long time period. The Jews faced conquering a local population, being in turn conquered by foreigners, empire, being slaves, decadence, barbarism, golden age, and dark ages. What the Jews consistently found was that in each situation, loyalty to God was the trait that worked. For atheists, this makes sense if you contextualize God as the objective laws of the universe. Thus, by following God, they were following universal positive principles. The reason the Jews have survived so long while practically everyone else from that era of history has fallen apart since is partly that the Jews have a very strong inbuilt introspective mechanism that allows them to adjust after failure. Failure has made the Jews stronger over history, which is the marker of a healthy nation. Healthy nations use struggle to improve, and weak nations are destroyed by struggle. The second reason the Jews survived was their
That makes sense.
incredibly high in-group cohesion. These shared history, rituals, specific customs, and the like that the Jews had gave them a very strong sense of identity. The Jews made themselves strange on purpose, purposely isolating themselves and pushing away outsiders in a way to create a large enough gulf between Jew and Gentile so that the Jews would always stick together when times got tough. With the tradition of Jewish prophets, you're seeing the Jewish priest class speaking out against the forces of entropy that had killed the other Asian civilizations. This included debt slavery, rising inequality, family breakdown, private quarrels, moral degeneracy, pagan gods, and weakness. The Ten Commandments is an incredibly advanced behavioral psychological understanding, and we don't realize it since this breakthrough occurred 3,000 years ago. The Jews, although they were a primitive desert herder people, were centuries to millennia more advanced mentally than the neighboring peoples. This was since the Jews had formed to avoid the failings of the neighboring older civilizations. The Jews were created in the rubble of the Bronze Age collapse. This was a time period in the 12th century BC in which a majority of civilization in the world collapsed in a 20-year period. This was due to a series of complex factors relating to the barbarian invasions, plague, climate change, military technological advancements, social structures, and other stuff. Watch my wonderful second podcast, History 102, if you're interested in hearing more about the Bronze Age collapse or early Jewish history. Fun fact, the Philistines in the Bible were the sea people which destroyed much of the civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean during the Bronze Age collapse. The sea peoples were also heavily ethnically intermixed with the Greeks, and thus it's not unimaginable that Goliath's grandfather fought at Troy. It's also funny that the term Philistine has become synonymous with someone who is aesthetically or artistically tasteless. The irony there is that the Philistines controlled the wealthy coastal cities of the Levant, while the Jews were barely literate hill tribes in the interior. The Philistines saw the Jews as savages. The second population in the American West I'm comparing to the Jews are the desert trash. I apologize if this is offensive to people who are part of this group. I'm from Pennsylvania, and I don't know this stuff since redneck is a term of pride. When I was driving from California to Texas, I kept running into this demographic of people I had no idea existed, since back home, every social group is practically centuries old. The desert trash are people who live in trailer parks out in the desert, or kind of low-class people who are really into guns or aliens in places like Arizona, Nevada, California, or New Mexico.
Hell yeah, brother.
I see similarities to Florida, which have their own variants. They have their own subculture, which is highly libertarian, but also degenerate at the same time. The desert trash people are often really interesting as individuals if you talk to them.
Yeah, they do sound interesting. You could probably have good conversations with them.
They'll have weird hobbies, are from all over the country, and normally have a story or two. The desert trash end up being in the desert since in the urban culture of America, it's becoming too inhospitable for human procreation and thriving. The desert trash people tend to not be stupid in many cases, but rather people who couldn't handle the 8 to 7 work schedule.
Yeah, so they like kind of monged out, they stressed out, and then boom, they go to the desert and aliens and all that, but they still have kids.
The loneliness and soullessness, so they snapped and moved out to the desert. It wouldn't surprise me if, as the cities get sicker, if the desert trash form their own distinct subculture that over the course of centuries perhaps repopulates the American West if something goes really bad. These are the sorts of
The alien people are gonna continue uh, America.
things that are happening in the Bronze Age as the old civilizations decayed and collapsed. The first potential records for a people who could be the Jews is from the Egyptian records, who wrote about a people called the Hapiru, who were a social class of bandits on the edge of Egypt who existed as a sort of subjugated nation. Egypt at this point was a multicultural society in which the lower Nile Delta was filled with dozens of somewhat assimilated, conquered, or immigrant peoples. The Hapiru were a sort of Semitic desert trash population which accumulated people who didn't fit in the Bronze Age aristocratic extractive social structure. Over time, they formed as a distinct ethnic identity, and then my guess is that Moses took the helm, establishing a very strange religion to unify this population that didn't have much else. Abraham fled Uruk due to the idol worship there, and I think that's symbolic of how the Middle East had been taken over by a bureaucratic, sclerotic, and unimaginative religion which stifled any innovation or progress.
Bureaucracy.
Lots of temples actively pushed prostitution for religious reasons. The priests held enormous wealth, keeping a lot of the population as slaves. Every action required a magical bribe for the priests to keep evil spirits away, and creativity or innovation was impossible under a mess of religious regulations. This was the greatest reason the old civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia went into decline to later be conquered by the Persians and the Greeks. Although the Jews did get pretty autistic on religion later on, they were careful that it wasn't enough to genuinely stifle their national character and vitality. The thing the Jews were able to do is to take up the advanced religious ideas these older civilizations had developed but were incapable of putting into action. The Jews were a desert herder people from the fringes of Egypt who had none of the hang-ups that the older temple societies had. There's been a long-standing battle in the Middle East between the farmers and herders. The farmers have established urban societies that were more cultured, urbane, degenerate, and peaceful. Christianity became a religion of the city people. Then there were the herders who were more tough, patriarchal, taboo-oriented, and monotheistic. Judaism, followed by Islam, were manifestations of this. In the long term, the culture of the herders won out, and when you read the Bible, a lot of what they were doing was a herder people who had recently settled into an urban society who were trying to avoid the degeneracy they saw in previous or other urban societies. One of the facts which took me a lot of time to figure out but became very useful for me once I did is that in the same way you'll hear about Mesopotamian or Egyptian or Hittite or Persian civilization, there was a Syrian Aramaean civilization that stretched across the entire Levant and included the Canaanites and the Phoenicians, and it's why Aramaean was the language a lot of the Bible was spoken in or written in initially, where Christ spoke Aramaean. And this Aramaean Syrian culture was quite important to the ancient world. It became the dominant language of both Assyria and the Persian Empire, I believe. And the Jews were a fringe group from the Aramaean civilization, or the Syrian civilization, where they were on the edges with the Arabian desert, having a lot of nomadic cultural influences. And in this fringe position, they established a new religion pulling elements from the older Syrian civilization, which was both a part and also incredibly distinct from said Syrian civilization. And so when the Jews conquered the Canaanites, they were an iteration of the same civilization as the Canaanites, who had an enormous religious breakthrough, which they tried to and succeeded at enforcing upon the Canaanites. Judaism became a sponge for lots of other religious ideas in that region in that era. Monotheism was originally an Egyptian religious concept in which Egypt went through a brief period of government-enforced monotheism before sliding back into the worship of the old gods. If Moses grew up in the court of Egypt, as the Bible suggests, and keep in mind the Pharaoh of Egypt probably had thousands of harem girls, so it makes sense that Moses incorporated a failed concept in Egypt. On top of this, the idea of God and the devil fighting each other, or angels and demons, is from Persian Zoroastrianism, a concept of hell, and a lot of the later theological concepts about reaching heaven and metaphysical stuff stem from the Greeks, and most of the myths in the book of Genesis have very strong parallels in Mesopotamian mythology. Jewish monotheism formed gradually over the course of thousands of years, in that in the first chapters of the Bible, which were written around 2,000 years before the birth of Christ, while modern Judaism reached its current form around 500 BC with the Axial Age. Keep in mind, at the very same time, around the world in 500 BC, you saw Socrates, Buddha, Confucius, and Lao Tzu living around that era with a huge religious breakthrough called the Axial Age. Over time, the Jews gradually purged their pagan gods and worship of local spirits called Baals until they only venerated one god. Part 2, God's Chosen People. In the other video, I spoke about a concept I invented called the master key, which is another term for a skeleton key, where the master key is once you've studied a complex topic enough, and you can simplify the soul of that topic into a single sentence, which can explain incredible complexity about it. The master key for the Jews is that they believe they are God's chosen people. Without understanding that,
I heard about this actually before.
none of the Jews' actions will make sense. The Greek genre of tragedy is predicated upon the idea that for the great, their greatest strength is also their downfall. This is foundational to Aristotle's entire philosophy, and you can see it play out with the Jews as well. That their greatest strengths and their greatest issues comes from their belief that they are God's chosen people. The Jews have historically believed themselves.
If they believe this, and to what degree do they enforce it? Because that will create a lot of hatred, envy, whatever you want to say. Like, if I go around telling people I'm the chosen one, that if I just say that, people are gonna think negatively about that, and they'll jump to conclusions like, I mean, I think I'm better than you. In what way?
To be superior to other peoples. The problem with Jews have historically comes from their belief that they are God's chosen people. The Jews have historically believed themselves to be superior to other peoples. The problem with this is that it was true enough, in that the Jews were gradually able to excel in nearly every field, whether economics, family life, community, religion, science, and philosophy, that it fed into the Jews' delusions while filling other nations with murderous envy. If the Albanians said they were God's chosen people, we'd just say that was adorable with contempt mixed in. But when a population says they're God's chosen people, and then their tiny religion...
And they have like results that speak on that, yeah, of course nations are gonna get envious and mad and angry. But what did he say? That they let it get to their head, right? That whole thing
becomes world conquering, with now a majority of the world's population following the Jewish God, it gets more arguable. The will of God is a dangerous and chaotic thing. God is a reflection of all things, and thus the ability to draw from it is both incredibly powerful and dangerous. I think that a lot of the ritual prescriptions and obsessive taboos of Jewish culture come from having some desire for psychological stability with the knowledge that they are this nuclear reactor for divine inspiration in their worldview. One of the things the Jews have a tendency to do is call the bluff on civilizational cycles. To explain this, I have a system based off Spengler in which we are at the end of the third age, much like Lord of the Rings, with each age lasting a little bit over 2,000 years. The first cycle, that we know of at least, started with the rise of the River Valley civilizations in 3000 BC and ended with the Bronze Age collapse in the 12th century BC. The second cycle, which formed out of the rubble of that Dark Age, involved the Indian, Chinese, Greco-Roman, Persian, Jewish, and Phoenician civilizations. These are the Axial Age civilizations, concentrated around 40 degrees north, and they fell apart with the collapse around the time of the fall of Rome or the Han Dynasty. Finally, the third cycle is the West, Orthodox, Islam, Japan, and Southeast Asian civilization, in which they formed in the Dark Ages, while they'll probably get wiped out by mouse utopia or nuclear war or genetically engineered diseases. I don't know, man. In the end of the first cycle, Judaism formed as a reaction to the degeneracy of the Bronze Age world, as we spoke about before. In the second cycle, the Jews formed Christianity.
Yeah, what's the word for it? I paid attention to that. I remembered that.
At the end of the first cycle, Judaism formed as a reaction to the degeneracy of the Bronze Age world, as we spoke
So they formed it because of degeneracy and stuff.
About before. In the second cycle, the Jews formed Christianity as a reaction to the issues with the decaying classical civilization. People might be triggered by me saying this, but the Jews invented Christianity because it's obviously true. Christ was ethnically Jewish, as were all the apostles, and they worshiped the Jewish God through a Jewish religious structure. Christ saw himself as repairing Judaism to return it to its old roots, which had been forgotten. The majority of the Jewish community rejected Christianity, but Christianity is an extension of Judaism in one form or another. Watch the video I made explaining early Christianity or classical civilization if you're interested, but Christianity was a rejection of the brutality of the Greco-Roman classical civilization. At the same time, Christianity is theologically as indebted to the Greeks as it is to Judaism, since so much of Christianity is from Greek philosophic or religious concepts. The biggest demographic for developing Christianity were Greek-speaking diaspora Jews. In a society in which 1/4 of the population were slaves, without legal rights, where men were slaughtered in the gladiatorial games for entertainment, and where Rome held the world under its boot, Christianity stood for universal love, a society based off morality and not extraction. Christianity ultimately destroyed the classical world, replacing it, so the Romans were right to fear the Christians and see them as dangerous radicals. There were a huge amount of Jews in the Arabian Peninsula at the time of the Prophet Muhammad, and Muhammad was a merchant, so he dealt with a lot of Jews. And if you look at the theological structure of Islam, it's closer to Judaism than it is to Christianity, since they were both developed by Semitic herder peoples. And there was a lot of cross-mixing between Jews and Muslims in the first few centuries because they had mutual respect for the others. So, on top of this, as Islam worships Yahweh, or the God of Abraham, out of the three largest religions in the world, Islam, Christianity, and Marxism, they all ultimately stem from Judaism. Meanwhile, for the third cycle,
Damn, I have no idea about any of this stuff. Really, really interesting. But this is not something I can bring up in a conversation, you know? No way, because I'll sound like an idiot trying to explain this to somebody else.
one which is operating today,
But I enjoy learning stuff and reacting to stuff like this on this channel. I hope you guys are too.
the Jews invented Marxism. They all ultimately stem from Judaism. Meanwhile, for the third cycle, the one which is operating today, the Jews invented Marxism, which is to our society what Christianity was to the classical world. Although I'm not insinuating that Marxism and Christianity are equally virtuous, the Jews have a tendency of making cultural movements greater than they themselves, which later turn on them, which was true for both Christianity and communism. Then it became taboo to say that the Jews developed them. However, Marxism was developed by an ethnic Jew from a family of rabbis. Marxism was made by a Jew, but leftism as a whole was not, since most of modern leftism stems back to France at the time of the French Revolution. However, Jews were also vastly disproportionately communist, especially in certain contexts like the Russian Revolution, postmodernism, or mid-20th century American leftism. Communism
It feels like I'm watching a video I'm not really supposed to be watching. I don't know what the response is going to be for this one.
stems from how the vast depersonalization, urbanization, postmodernism, or mid-20th century American leftism. Communism stems from how the vast depersonalization, urbanization, feminization, and loss of religion caused by the Industrial Revolution created these enormous dissatisfied populations, which could be easily manipulated to destroy society. Communism, much like the early Christians, weren't seen as being religions at the time period they formed, but rather atheism, since they're formulated so differently to the previously understood religions. But both communism and Christianity really are religions. At the same time, communism, like early Christianity, acted as a force of social anarchy, poking in the pain point of the older society. I've also said this before, but I want to point it out again,
Yeah, once I too kind of started to see different like beliefs and stuff like that as just religion. There's people who don't believe in God or and such, but they believe in the religion of science, you know. They believe it so much that they'll just blindly trust it. And yeah, once you start seeing it like that, it kind of it calmed me down at least. Like now I kind of see more. But
that you can't draw a. I've also said this before, but I want to point it out again, is that you can't draw a one-to-one relationship between the Jews and communism or the left, in the same way you can't for Christians either. In the same way the Christians became mostly non-Jewish fairly quickly and then persecuted the Jews, the communists did the same. Stalin horrifically oppressed the Jews and was about to genocide them before he died. The modern left is horrifically anti-Semitic now, regularly justifying genociding the Jews. I find it crazy that when I read them before he died. The modern left is horrifically anti-Semitic now, regularly justifying.
yeah, I see that stuff. I don't pay attention, or like I really don't know anything about it. That Israel Palestine stuff.
Genociding the Jews. I find it crazy that when I went to school, we had years of anti-Holocaust programming, and now those very same people.
I remember that we in like history, although I at the time I didn't care what an idiot I was. Now I care about history, but when I was younger, I remember from what I do remember from school is we never ever learned about anything other than like World War II. That's all we learned about. Like that's all I can remember. Like we never touched on like Egypt or Greek or like Spartans and cool stuff like that, like pyramids and stuff. We didn't. I'm a little bit like I'm a little disappointed, a little angry about that, because maybe I could have found the love for history sooner, right? But yeah, now that's completely out the window. What he's talking about now, it's like suddenly some kind of like switch happened, and now people just hate Jews.
People, or leftists, are now actively supporting the Intifada. It's just the mental disjoint. But back on topic, at the same time, the Jews are incredibly overrepresented in literally everything.
They see themselves, like, it's crazy how they see themselves as the most, like, kind and caring and loving and compassionate, whereas it's like "Arr," they're the first one to do that. I notice.
Not just left-wing politics. The Jews are like other groups, but more. I like to joke it's a struggle to find anyone who's neither Jewish nor gay on the far right today. The degree of wisdom Judaism selected for, as well as their distance from other cultures, provides a degree of objectivity through which the Jews could analyze other societies in order to have the ability to create these enormous sociological breakthroughs. I don't think it's a coincidence that the intellectual innovations which broke down the high modernist, Victorian, mechanistic, rational model of the world were Jewish. Freud showed a subconscious psychology motivated by sex, while Einstein showed a universe where space and time were the same, which could get ripped up. Both of them demonstrate a mental flexibility you could see from their ancestors wielding the Kabbalic mysticism rather than the Northwest European philosophy, which had become highly mechanical. Part of the reason the Nazis an entire lifetime
Mechanical, like autistic, or
of which had become highly mechanical. Part of the reason the Nazis an entire lifetime of German philosophy hated the Jews was that the Germans realized that the only actual competitors for the direction of the future of thought or intellectualism against the Nordic peoples were the Jews. On the highest level of practically religious abstract thought, which determines your entire worldview, you had either Nordic or Jewish thinkers in the 19th and 20th centuries. There's a certain dualistic
interesting what he brought up. So that's kind of why it's like they were it was a competition between that. I have never thought about that.
Irony that after the Nazis killed the Jews in the Holocaust, Nordic philosophy and vitality died as much as the Jews did. The Greeks and Romans had a similar feeling in the ancient world with the Jews. However, there are several cognitive traits you see in Jewish philosophy due to believing they are God's chosen people. One is messianism, which leads to delusion. In the centuries after classical civilization's rule, the Jewish religious leadership were constantly embroiled in religious experiences that the current world was about to end. They had these prophecies that a new Messiah would arise and result in the Jews conquering the Roman Empire, which was true, just not how they thought. However, this resulted in the Jews launching hopeless revolts against far greater colonial empires, which the Jews had zero chance of ever winning, except when it worked out under the Seleucids. This was since they believed if they followed God, he would grant them victory. This is the origin of why Jews face so many depredations under foreign conquerors, including multiple mass expulsions out of Israel, including under the Babylonians and Romans. Past a certain threshold, the foreign conquerors just got tired of the Fifth Revolt and genocided the Jews. I'm Irish, and so I'm a sucker for this kind of stuff, since we also have a thing for hopeless revolts against foreign conquerors. However, it made the Jews seen as incredibly intolerable and practically insane at the time. On top of this, the Jewish belief that
So they just kept revolting and like the nation just grew tired of that.
They were God's chosen people, with their God being the one true God, was intolerable for foreign conquerors.
Yeah, it's like if I pull up in like somebody's house and they're one religion and I'm like, my God is the best, like you get away, like I'm the chosen one, I follow this God. Yeah, of course they're gonna throw me out the house. Like,
the Romans were incredibly tolerant as ancient empires went, while the Jews and Christians were practically the only religions the Romans persecuted, since the Romans could tolerate anything except those who could not tolerate the Roman gods. Judaism is possibly the most feminine of the major world religions in that its emphasis on submission to an irrational God, it follows lots of ritual prescriptions, and it values family and community above all else. On top of this, the idea that if you follow the religious rules, things will work out, not prizing independence or strength as much as other cultures. When you look at Jewish history, they normally utilize feminine indirect evolutionary strategies to survive, since they've been so physically threatened for their history that they play into feminine strategies which were developed in order to counterbalance women's physical weakness versus men. Once you get further into the world, the Jews...
I understood. Oh man, I understood what he said just now. Wow, interesting.
Indirectly made, that of the huge monotheistic religions, you see a similar dichotomy. In an era in which every major religion waged religious wars, the Jews were just too easy a target. They were wealthy, couldn't militarily defend themselves, were spread out all over, were universally disliked, had high in-group loyalty, have actively made themselves different from other cultures, are an easy out-group to scapegoat.
So they went into, let's say they went into a country, right? They wouldn't cooperate with the local people. They would prioritize their own above all else, stuff like that. I mean, that creates like friction and stuff, right?
And were different from other cultures, are an easy out-group to scapegoat, and were quite openly arrogant about stating their superiority. The brutal answer for why the Jews have faced so much discrimination in so many lands has been there's historically been every reason to hurt the Jews and very few not to. Over the course of centuries, cultures default back onto anti-Semitism when times get tough. Part of me muses for literary purposes if Abraham in the Arabian desert 4,000 years ago saw some semblance of the future of his people when he signed that contract with God. I wonder if he stared into the future, knowing his people, by saying they were God's chosen people, would open themselves up to a world of hurt. That this would create a cycle in which the Jews would face suffering, it would bind them closer to God and their community, only to be batted onwards for the cycle to restart. In this musing, perhaps God makes these knots or consistent patterns of behavior which he can reliably use to reach certain ends. Depth and spirituality stem from suffering, in that suffering is the burning away of weakness, which allows one to reach the divine. Perhaps the deal is something like that the Jews, by putting themselves in such a vulnerable position, ended up in an incentive in which they faced enormous suffering. Perhaps said suffering also allowed the Jews to tap into enormous spiritual depths, which made them a vessel for religious breakthroughs. Part 3. The Ghetto. I'm not really part of the whole leftism is Judaism argument, which, as I explained in my video on the anthropology of the left, you see a wide variety of different groups, also pivotal in the left's development, between the French Calvinists, bureaucracy, and women. However, the Jews are still disproportionate, and even more so in certain subsections of leftism, such as postmodernism. Most American Jews are now more culturally leftist than Jewish, since Jews, for the most part, have assimilated into the urban monoculture, which is experiencing cultural and demographic collapse now. I think this is a useful way to look at an interesting anthropological analysis of diaspora Judaism. What does this show about how the Jews lived that gives them this modern political preference? In the period after the Roman expulsion, in which Jews were forced out of Palestine, they then scattered across the whole world. There were Jewish populations hugging the Mediterranean basin, alongside many in Iraq or even further east. Later on, they migrated to Europe and America. If you're more interested, watch the previous video I released on the different Jewish diasporas. I've read enough histories of the Jews that I'm starting to notice patterns in how they're written. After the ancient period, in which you have lots of battles and emperors, in the period after the forced Roman expulsion and before the Industrial Revolution, you struggle to find anything going on in Judaism besides religion. I call it the boring middle, when the Jews were living in isolated ghetto communities, holding on to their old religion with all their force. The Jews lived in shtetls or ghettos, a word stemming from the Jewish ghetto in Rome, or self-enclosed communities of Jews who lived completely isolated from the local Gentile populations, normally walled off so there's as little intercourse as possible. The ghettos were self-governing, operating under their own law, and for the life of an average Jew, practically nothing of importance occurred outside the ghetto. After the diaspora, the Jews became an almost entirely urban culture, almost never owning land. Urban populations were never sustainable in the pre-industrial period, and it's kind of a mystery how the Jews were able to maintain a stable population as an almost entirely urban nation. Every city in the pre-industrial world was a demographic sink, and it's still true today for different reasons, but in the pre-industrial era, it was because the amount of diseases concentrated in cities killed people off faster than they had children, especially given how crowded cities were. And it's a mystery how the Jews were able to maintain their stable population, not gradually going extinct, while almost being entirely urban. And you wonder how many of the Jewish religious, dietary, and health obsessions stemmed from trying to lower the disease death rate to not face the normal population decline seen in cities. The Jews were more connected to their continent-spanning ghetto networks than the local populations a mile away.
So that what he's saying, from what I got, so they lived in these cities and they had to be like clean, I guess, to not die of diseases. So maybe that's why like cleanliness and stuff like that is seen as like a good thing in like religion and stuff like that. Although I don't know much about it.
This created mutual suspicion between the Jewish and Gentile populations. There's a few interesting elements of ghetto life. One was that they were these sort of strange artificial cultures that stemmed from never having to govern or protect the regions they were in and with no connection to the land. Other cultures developed strong hierarchies, aggressive warrior cultures based off honor, aristocracies, or peasant cultures rooted in the earth. The Jews didn't, and much of the current issues of the delusion of many Jewish thinkers in the modern world is they're subconsciously projecting the social structure of the Jewish ghetto, which existed in a very specific historic context that can't be replicated elsewhere. There's an interesting book called The Ordeal of Civility, which looks at how Jewish thinkers from the early industrial era, such as Marx, Freud, or Leo Strauss, were trying to square assimilating into modern culture.
Wait, I have to save that one book.
Marx, Freud, or Leo Strauss were trying to square assimilating into modern culture. On top of this, how many of the theories they were developing were themselves attempts to recreate the ghetto culture on an international scale? The ghetto was a society without pronounced social class, a theocracy with no military, no privacy, or politeness. They had enormous...
What? That sounds like Karl Marx, like Marxism. Ha! This is blowing my mind.
Welfare to take care of the poorer members, while everyone belonged to a highly constrictive society which controlled their every action with enormous mutual social trust. In the ghetto, things worked since it was such a small, cohesive community, bound together by a strong religion. Look, we just described communism, and
Yeah.
you could see Marxism.
That's exactly what I was thinking. I was like, no way.
As an attempt to turn the entire world into a Jewish-style ghetto community. The Jews were frequently
Really? Wow.
perturbed by the idea of civility, or the politeness that West Europeans prized so deeply a century ago. They were all convinced it was some kind of lie or sham, and they faced enormous neuroses about not fitting in with the society. What they fail to realize is that European culture is fundamentally aristocratic, in which politeness stemmed from a culture of heroic individualism, in which you had courtesy, so you wouldn't get murdered for insulting someone's honor. Jewish culture had no concept of martial honor, and so always writes it up as repression, with Freud being the most notable example. Fun fact, the ordeal of civility likes to say that Freud's id was similar to the yid, to show how much like the mind, the average recently assimilated Jew would put up a mask of civility before making a mistake that showed his ghetto roots. These thinkers, although this doesn't include all Jews, never understood Western concepts of individualism, honor, heroism, nationalism, freedom, private property, and duty, since the Jews hadn't had enough military experience to cultivate these. When you're looking
Wow. No shot. If you think about it like that, shit just starts to make sense. Like, what?
at mismatches between things anti-Semites criticize Jews doing, it's normally a disjoint relating to this. Jewish culture tends to be built around following ideological principles,
Man, I couldn't even imagine, like, trying to explain this to somebody else, like, without referencing this video. You leave me alone with this information. Oh man, I'm cooked.
Perspective of actual world conditions, whether or not they make sense. For leftists of Jewish ancestry, they see this as furthering their religion of leftism, while for Western nationalists, it's the destruction of their nations. One wonders how the establishment of the first Jewish state in 2,000 years with Israel will change these dynamics. The Jews have spent so long wandering the world as a minority that now that they have to defend their own borders,
Yeah, now I don't know when was like, oh man, I don't even know when was Israel like boom, like created, like what the hell am I asking?
as they world as a minority, that now that they have to defend their own borders, as they've been very successful at doing, if Jewish thought and culture will see a profound shift towards those cultural traits which exist in other cultures. The Industrial Revolution was both the best and worst thing to happen to the Jews. Firstly, it pulled them out of the ghettos of Eastern Europe to global predominance. At the start of the Industrial Revolution, almost all Jews in the world lived in small Eastern European communities, practically stuck in medieval theocracy. And over a period of decades, they were vaulted into the center. And over a period of decades,
I'm from Latvia, so I guess they had Jews there.
They were vaulted.
They had what is it? Many in Poland. Yeah. Okay.
Vaulted into the center and the greatest level of global predominance for modern civilization. And that shift is so rapid, it has to be traumatic up to a certain point. At the same time, as I alluded to before, it caused a psychological collapse in their own sense of self. It's kind of sad to see what happened to so many Jews with the Industrial Revolution. The industrial world itself is nihilistic, but for the Jews, it was more pronounced, since they were so heavily psychologically dependent on a combination of religion and community. Jewish culture had accumulated an enormous amount of trauma from their history for obvious reasons. Culture and history affects people in a very profound way, etching itself into their bodies, minds, and souls. Thus, when both the all-consuming religious and community structure fell apart, these very intelligent Jewish thinkers were stuck as strangers in an alien Gentile world, apart from the old Jewish worldview, and with an enormous amount of cultural trauma. This is why you're looking at so many of the proponents of nihilism. It's frequently secular Jews, while you practically never see this behavior from religious Jews. On top of this, the Jews had faced so many centuries of discrimination at the hands of oppressive, nationalistic religious governments, you could see why it would be inside their self-interest to deconstruct those cultural and national institutions. In the last century, the industrial world is seeing social collapse for complex reasons, and the Jews were at the forefront of this trend due to reasons I explain in this text wall. Lots of modern leftist theory and philosophy were made by neurotic Jews in the mid-20th century who experienced all of these sociological trends that would slam modernity earlier than other people, so they were able to articulate it for everyone else. What this means is that the Jews were some of the spokespeople involved for the issues of modernity, but they themselves were not the drivers. The problem is that too many of modernity's issues are seen in contexts that have no Jews at all, like China, Japan, or Eastern Europe today. This is not PC to say, but so many of the issues today are so overtly caused by toxic femininity, and they openly claim that too, that blaming the Jews as the underlying driver feels silly. It feels like we're trying to deflect responsibility for the collapse of our own civilization to some group that's not even 1,000th of the world's population. Part of me wonders if the Jews aren't going to make it through the current era. Most American Jews today are only loosely Jewish, and they have one of the lowest birth rates of any group in the world in America. Will modernity swallow Judaism in the way Hellenism tried to and failed? However, at the same time, I know that the Jews are going to make it. Israel is one of the highest birth rates in religiosity of anywhere in the industrialized world. On top of that, they've already made it 4,000 years so far. They can't afford to lose here. I think the best thing the Jews could do is go back to God. The thing is that Jewish people are so married to the Jewish religion that I don't think they can survive without it. The Jews have a long history, and if they give up now, the game's going to get less interesting. The ones who are destroying society are the seculars, and so I've joked that putting pretty girls in Torah school could be a taxpayer service for societal psychological stability. Gotta grab some popcorn for the next 4,000 years. Who knows, maybe the Jews will make it to Alpha Centauri.
What a beautiful video. Learned a lot. I trust this dude. Smart as hell. Glad to see you covering an uncontroversial topic for a change. Yeah. Yeah, anyway, boys, what do you guys think? Did you learn something new? Do you have any questions or anything you want to add? Please write in the comments. Of course, sub, like, and comment to help me out with the algorithm. It really helps me out, and I appreciate everybody that tuned in and watched. And I see you boys in the next one, okay?